I'm Stephen Downs.
And I'm Adam Risby.
And this is Letters to the Sky, a podcast about the metaphysical iconoclasts, philosophical visionaries, and religious leaders of the world.
Whether you consider yourself religious, spiritual, neither, or something in between, we invite you to take a deep dive with us down metaphysical rabbit holes and learn to see your life from a new perspective.
Hey, Adam.
Hey, Stephen.
How are you?
I am fines.
You're fines? That's wonderful to hear. I'm glad you're fines. I'm also fines.
In the plural. Tell me, what book are we doing? And
Okay, so today we are doing one of the greatest, truly one of the greatest spiritual books of all time, or religious books, whichever you'd like to classify it as. It is The Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva. The edition we have, Adam's holding it up, I'm holding it up too. It's a little tiny, almost like a pocket-sized book with beautiful hardcover. It's translated by the Padmakara Translation Group, published in the Shambhala Library series. And it is a gorgeous little book. And I know there are several other translations. I have not read them, so I'm not here to compare translations, although I do really like the Padmakara translations in general. Well, I think there's a lot to say about this one. Mm-hmm. And I think for both of us, this particular book holds a real special significance in terms of its impact on our lives and its power in general as a tool for transformation. And yeah, do you mind saying a little bit about it at first? Do you mind diving into that? I could start too, but I think the audience wants to hear your beautiful voice.
Oh, well, we don't
know
if they do.
Do the beautiful voice, not your normal one.
I only have one voice, my friend. One voice. You know, it's funny. I was thinking a little bit about this book, and as I'm looking at it right now, it sort of feels like a Bible. I know I was kind of jokingly saying that to you, but it has that same kind of gravitas. In the Buddhist world, this is, especially in the Tibetan Buddhist world, this is beyond a classic. This is like a foundation stone, if you will, of Absolutely. The building, of the structure, of the edifice that is Buddhism. And it's written by a man named Shantideva. Now, Shantideva was born in 685 AD. He died in 763. He was an Indian philosopher. He was actually a student at the then world-famous Nalanda University, which was a center for Buddhism and academic studies that was world-renowned, even at that point. He was a Buddhist monk, and in particular, for those who are listening to this, who follow Buddhism, he was a student of Madhyamaka and an adherent to a particular understanding of Madhyamaka, which is that of Nagarjuna. I mean, there's so many amazing stories. Maybe I'll start off with one. There's going to be a couple more, but I'll start off with one. So Shantideva was a misfit. He got accepted into the university for being an exceptionally bright mind and a very novel thinker. My impression, this is a paraphrase of the stories that I've read, but my impression, he never did the homework. He kind of gave off the lazy genius vibe to me. People would bust their ass, and his colleagues and his students would come late at the end of the day, and Shantideva was basically resting or sleeping all day, and they're like, you didn't do anything, you're not ready for the test, right? And he'd be like, oh, but I know everything already, right? And then they would quiz him, and there's this really famous, well, I guess this is the premise of the book.
Yeah.
For anyone who actually knows this story out there, my sincerest, humblest apologies for the fact that I'm going to butcher it right now, but I will convey the feeling of it. So 3 or 4 of his colleagues were like, you don't know anything. You've never shown up to class. You don't do the homework. We're going to tell the head priest or whatever on you, or the abbot. And it goes all the way up to administration. Administration says, okay, if you want to keep your seat at the university, you have to give an impromptu talk in front of the whole assembly by the end of the week or something, or tomorrow. I'm not sure. Some amount of time that didn't allow for him to prepare. And he went up there and he started to give this treatise on...
Well, hold on. There's a funny twist to this. As he started speaking, he said, would you like to hear something from the Buddha or something completely new?
Yes, you're right.
And the audience was like, he's digging his own grave. Something completely new.
Something completely new. Oh, this is so good. Thank you for fleshing that out. So he begins to expound on several concepts, and the entire speech forms the body of this book that we see here. And there's this amazing section, which I have told Stephen multiple times and then proceed to forget that I've told him, only to have the joy of telling him again.
Happens so much in our relationship.
Happens so much. I think it's one of the last chapters, if not the last chapter, I believe, is second to last chapter, it looks like, called Wisdom. In the section of Wisdom, and I can't recall exactly which verse, this is second to last chapter, he's talking about emptiness and nothingness and knowing true nature of the mind. And as he's saying these particular verses, so the story goes, he begins to levitate off the dais, and then his body slowly dematerializes into thin air, basically. There's nothing there, and everyone is staring at this miracle, mouths agape, and yet the speech and the delivery of the last final chapter, the dedication chapter, continues with only a disembodied voice booming through the hall. That to me was, I was just like, wow, it's such a cool story and a moving story. And the fact that began to happen in the section called Wisdom, which it really is about seeing through to the emptiness of all reality in the Buddhist tradition. Very, very amazing story about the genesis of this book.
Absolutely, yeah. So Shantideva is kind of what would you call him?
Badass?
Badass. There you go. We can just call him badass. Yeah, it's great.
Badass.
So this book in general is just on a pure, material-wise. In Buddhism, I know we've covered it before, but it's worth refreshing. So the concept of bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is the enlightened attitude of mind, which in Buddhism encompasses the heart and the mind. Well, slightly different from what we would traditionally call the mind in the West. So it has to do with, there's two essentially broad categories of bodhicitta. There is relative bodhicitta, which is the outward kind of manifestation of a loving heart, of a loving mind, of compassion towards all sentient beings. And then there's ultimate bodhicitta, which is the pure perception of emptiness and the compassion that arises from that. And so they are kind of two sides of the same coin. And so this book takes the reader, it's essentially a very long prayer, is the way the book is structured, and it's structured into small verses. And it's a very long prayer that leads one all the way from talking about bodhicitta to what happens if you lose bodhicitta, to how to generate it further, to all the qualities of a bodhisattva, and then into the final, the last chapter is the dedication, but the final meaty chapter on wisdom, which is the unification of the relative and the ultimate bodhicitta. It's more of a semantic distinction. Thank you. Yeah. More of a semantic one, that really only matters when you're Buddhist. But the point of this is that it has to do with cultivating and practicing a compassionate state of mind and a heart. And this comes to the fundamental training in Mahayana Buddhism. So we've talked about Mahayana Buddhism quite a bit now, and Mahayana is kind of broken down into compassion and wisdom, and prajna and bodhicitta. And so those two go hand in hand in Buddhism. So in Buddhism, prajna without compassion is bad, and compassion without prajna is incomplete. And so there, to say it roughly, in Mahayana Buddhism, as one trains in it, one is always balancing one's practice towards developing bodhicitta. As we see, we're going to go into that, and the chapter we're doing today is on generating bodhicitta, and then also developing the ability to have non-dual perception, for lack of a better word. And this is done through mind training in Buddhism. So that's the foundation, the pedagogical, foundation for how this book is used by actual Buddhists. And so this book is basically a really beautiful, long prayer about bodhicitta and about ultimately non-dual wisdom. And so, Adam, do you want to tell us a little bit about this chapter that we chose to do in particular?
Yeah. I remember first reading this chapter when I was in fellowship at Stanford, and I remember I took this book with me on a hike, And I had gone up to a tree in the middle of the mountains, and I started reading this. And it was a particularly challenging day, and I saw some particularly challenging cases. And that day, I really had a soft heart, like really seeing how a lot of people were suffering and the challenges that they go through, right? And a lot of the deaths that family members had to deal with. And there was something that really struck me in reading this chapter at that exact moment, which was that there's so much suffering in this world. Like truly, truly, there's so much suffering in this world. And Shantideva here brings to form a feeling that I think we've all had at some point, which is when we see another suffering, we yearn to be the source of the relief of their suffering, right? And what's particularly beautiful about this, and maybe I'll start with the quotes here, he speaks about the different forms of suffering and then the specific ways he yearns to be present to help relieve that. So for example, verse 9, again, we're doing chapter 3, taking hold of bodhicitta, or compassion. He says, raining down a flood of food and drink, may I dispel the ills of thirst and famine. And in the eons marked by scarcity and want, may I myself appear as drink and sustenance. That's particularly striking for me because there's this idea of reincarnation or transmigration in the Buddhist tradition, and whether or not one believes in that, there's this idea of here's a man wishing to take the form of sustenance and food and drink to ease the suffering of others. Even if it's taken in a purely poetic or metaphorical level, it brings expression to this feeling inside of me that I had very, poignantly in that time in my life, and many times since then, where I see someone suffering, and I may not be able to, as Adam, go there and help them with what they're doing, right? They may be halfway across the world or suffering from something that I can't impact or change, or, many reasons why I can't play a role in helping them. But the yearning to do so is still there. And this is why I think if there's anyone that's still listening to this episode who's not a Buddhist, yeah, I know, who's not a Buddhist, like, please trust me in telling you that you don't need a Buddhist to have something awaken in your heart when reading these very poetic lines. And at the very least, what this does is it opens up this feeling of compassion, like really feeling the suffering of others and then generating the yearning to help them.
Absolutely. I completely relate. And as you were saying this, I really related this portion in particular, but yeah, I'd say this chapter in particular to the prayer of St. Francis.
Oh, so good.
Which is obviously such a powerful, moving Christian prayer. And it has the same energy, same tone.
Yeah, let me read it.
Yeah, go ahead. You're going to read the prayer of St. Francis, but not the whole chapter that we're doing?
No, the prayer of St. Francis is not that long.
I know, it's really short. Okay.
Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is error, the truth. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
I love it. I mean, right. This is just about a direct correlate.
And great catch, great connection.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And I want to take a moment. There's a lot to say here. And I know that this episode isn't really going to be like a commentary verse by verse or anything like that, but this kind of attitude, this attitude of that I'm going to call bodhicitta, this giving up of oneself, in the way of the Bodhisattva, Shantideva, in this chapter, indeed, Shantideva talks about the Buddhist practice of giving up one's flesh, giving up one's blood to feed the demons, to feed all the beings that crave it, so that it may heal them, so that it may satisfy their thirst. And this is a metaphor. It's not Well, it's a metaphor. But this notion of giving oneself up, then Shantideva goes on to say, to then, after having given these things away, ask for them back is theft from the people you gave it to, from the beings you've given it to. And so once you do that act of giving this part of yourself up, giving up your need to satisfy your own self, to, we could call it your ego, like satisfy your ego, and to give everything to beings for their benefit of enlightenment, that is such a powerful selfless act that through Mahayana practice, we practice over and over, making it easier and easier and easier. It is at complete odds with like normal life. I tend to think of, last episode was a conversation about science versus religion, but if we look at like the concept of natural selection, right? The concept that you have an entire population and the weak die and the fit survive. And that is how life works, right? That's how life evolves. And this is a conscious decision to suspend that for the benefit of others. I've just been reflecting lately on what a flip it is, what a conscious decision to give up oneself for others. Mm-hmm. And what a beautiful, profound mind training that is. Because really, we can talk about these concepts very intellectually. My initial discussion of like relative versus ultimate bodhicitta, blah, 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 blah. But like, these are practices. Like this is a prayer. And when we take this on and we work with it day by day, week by week, year by year, there is this ease of love, this ease of compassion that starts effortlessly flowing from our hearts and our minds towards others. And this kind of compassion and love and peace just dissolves on its own those kind of like hard barriers to survival that I think we all come into this world with or are trained into, for lack of a better word. And I can't speak highly enough of this book or of other, even the Prayer of St. Francis, but since we're speaking of this, I can't speak highly enough of the Way of the Bodhisattva. And it was almost lost, it was, maybe lost is a strong word. It was almost kind of relegated away. So we didn't talk about this in the beginning, but a quick little anecdote is that, so all of this in particular got translated into Tibetan, but it was kind of not taught. It was only taught at a few different monasteries. And then in the 1800s, we'll do an episode on Sunday, wandering master named Patrul Rinpoche, basically dressed like a beggar, had no possessions, but he taught this incessantly. And he taught the importance of the Way of the Bodhisattva to lay people, to monastics, to everybody. And he was pretty much single-handedly responsible for its revival in modern Tibetan Buddhism. And we have Patrul Rinpoche to thank for that. And he taught at length all the time about this book. And that was one of his great gifts to Buddhism in the 1800s. But this training is, to come back to, it's easy to talk about it intellectually, about the benefits of it, but like really on a practical level, it is such a beautiful seed to water and to feed in one's self that is very, very worth looking into, worth pursuing, if you weren't already.
Yeah, for those interested in another book, I brought it here just in case. It's called Enlightened Vagabond by Mathieu Ricard. Now, Mathieu Ricard, if you know, is one of the primary translators for the Dalai Lama. And this book is called The Life and Teachings of Patrul Rinpoche. He's so revered of a teacher that, I think, as you said, Stephen, bringing back the Way of the Bodhisattva is just one of the many things that he did. In particular, he was a student of the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism. So there's a lot that he did to revive that particular school and all the lineages that come from Patrul Rinpoche and the pointing out practice and everything. But so the Way of the Bodhisattva. Also, what is a bodhisattva?
Oh, man. Okay. I'm going to speak it very plainly and non-intellectually, which is I tend to do. A bodhisattva is someone who has taken a vow to enlighten all beings. That is what they vow. And they vow to come back in as many lifetimes as is necessary to do so. And the Shantideva does say that you can take it on your own if you don't have a master nearby, but it's best taken in front of a master for just the solemnity and the consecration of that. But it is a vow to practice just like the Buddhas and all the steps of attainments and of realizations that they did and of building compassion and things like that, to practice just as they did to relieve all beings from suffering. There's kind of a catch-22 with this. And so in Buddhism, sentient beings are considered limitless. And so the notion that you are vowing to free them all is kind of a catch-22. It's just like we're talking about this bodhicitta, you are giving up the quick attainment of enlightenment. You are saying, I will continue to embody for all beings until they're all enlightened. It's a very powerful, that in and of itself, taking the Bodhisattva vow as a daily practice is an incredibly powerful practice. All of these practices tend to be self-contained almost.
Yeah.
Did I do a good job?
Yeah, that was phenomenal. You just made me think about how fascinating it is that in many traditions, there's the idea of bringing the attention away from the self, away from the individual identity, right? I feel like that is such a healthy part of the spiritual path. Instead of being so self-absorbed with one's own troubles and tribulations, you turn the searchlight out to others and their suffering. Now, the other interesting thing about the Bodhisattva vow is you vow to enlighten others as if there was someone out there.
Sure. I mean,
right?
Yeah, we get into that.
Yeah. I'm just planting a little seed, There's something, I think, to a point where you're getting close to realizing the nature of reality and the nature of the mind. You start to realize there's no one out there and there's no one here for that matter, right? So what are you vowing to? But nevertheless, even at that stage, to recommit to that vow is incredibly powerful and important, because then you won't let among many other reasons to do this, you won't let any shred of a possibility of ego take hold and grow again, but rather continually giving up of yourself, of the false belief of an ego identity.
Absolutely. And, as you said, was very valid, and the ultimate realization that there is no self, that there are no others. And I think one of the nice things about this is I'm a big fan of training under teachers as opposed to trying to figure stuff out yourself. And one of the benefits of training under other teacher is that if you say something like that, a good teacher will slap you, because you don't win points for technicalities in Buddhism. You win points for sincerity.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's just a lovely practice. It's definitely one of the practices closest to my heart. It brings such a delightful softness to one over time. And I think that's something that the world benefits from.
Yeah. Shall we dive into some more
verses? I was just thinking that. Let's please. Do you have something for us?
I'll just read a couple more that gets at that same idea.
Well, hold on. Can we go back and...
Sure.
I want to just touch... Sorry to interrupt, but real quick. This chapter is all about gaining hold of bodhicitta, right? So kind of this notion that in Buddhism, one has karma, and that karma leads one to future lives. And the ability to have the fortunate karma of being in a human body, relatively free from restrictions, so that one is able to practice the Dharma or to practice Buddhism or whatever it may be, that is a great gift. And it is in Buddhism considered a fleeting gift. And so part of this chapter is, the context of the chapter is Shantideva really imploring us to firmly grasp hold of bodhicitta and not let go. And so this chapter is all about the generation of it as a practice, as opposed to other chapters in the book. So, okay, please continue. I just wanted to give that little bit of context.
Oh, sure. I wanted to go back to really the very beginning, the first verse. With joy I celebrate the virtue that relieves all beings from the sorrows of the states of loss, exulting in the happy states enjoyed by those who yet are suffering. I revel in the stores of virtue, cause of gaining the enlightened state, and celebrate the freedom won by living beings from the round of pain. And in the Buddhahood of the protectors I delight, and in the grounds of realization of the Buddha's heirs. Their enlightened attitude, an ocean of great good that seeks to place all beings in the state of bliss, and every action for the benefit of beings. Such is my delight and joy. And so I join my hands and pray. The Buddhas who reside in every quarter, kindle now the Dharma's light for those who grope, bewildered in the dark of pain. The image here is so beautiful. He opens this chapter of compassion. This is what I think Tibetan Buddhism does nicely. Compassion, specifically bodhicitta, is not really related to the etymological root of the word compassion, which is to suffer with.
Right.
It's not that quality. He opens a chapter on the generation of bodhicitta with joy. He's like, how joyful I am. I'm celebrating. It's a delight for me to be with the Buddhas and the Buddha's heirs, and I join my hands in prayer. I don't know for you, but I can feel he truly is joyful in his ability to be able to generate this with everyone that's listening. And that, I think, speaks to the heart of the meaning of compassion in this context. It is a joyful endeavor.
It is. And it's actually, there's a lot of subtext to this. And so there's another book that I have, I don't know if you actually have it, Adam, called The Nectar of Manjushri's Speech. And it's actually thicker than The Way of the Bodhisattva, but it is a commentary on The Way of the Bodhisattva by one of Patrul Rinpoche's students. And in it, he talks about how, in the practice of generating bodhicitta, these are the first two steps, what you just read. And it's, Shantideva was leading us somewhere in his, the skill of which he did. So the first one is celebrating the successes of others. So in this case, celebrating other people, other beings who have grasped hold of this, who have grasped hold of this kind of thing. Like that is like an antidote in Buddhism. I'm actually not sure if they'd classify that as an antidote, but an antidote in Buddhism is typically the counter to something. So in this case, like the counter to selfishness is to selflessly celebrate an other's success, right? And so that's a really powerful tool that Buddhists use to train the mind to come out of selfish, envy, especially because envy is such a destructive emotion. And then the next part that you read was beseeching the Buddhas to turn the wheel of Dharma, right? And so this is another practice that one does. So there's all these practices in Buddhism that are based, actually, I don't know if they're based on the way of the Bodhisattva or if this is predates the way of the Bodhisattva, but beseeching a teacher to turn the wheel of Dharma means basically to continue teaching for the benefit of all beings. And when the Buddha famously was enlightened, he said, what I have is too profound. I can't possibly teach it because no one will understand. And then some of the Hindu gods, Brahma and Indra, begged the Buddha to teach. And so he did. So this has become a practice among Buddhists, is to request that the teacher turns the wheel of Dharma and teaches. And then the next part that you didn't read was the last part of this three-ver. And that is, do you have it? Are you reading it?
Yeah.
Go ahead and read it. Just the next verse or two.
I join my hands beseeching the enlightened ones who wish to pass into nirvana. Do not leave us wandering in blindness. Stay among us for unnumbered ages.
There you go. So then the next one is, through these actions now performed and all the virtues I have gained, may all the pain of every living being be wholly scattered and destroyed. So the last part of that was beseeching the teacher or the Buddhas to remain, to continue teaching, to not pass on and leave the body. There's a whole series of prayers that are developed out of this, whether they be long life prayers or arti in Hinduism, that are really, calling the guru, the teacher, to remain, to not leave the students. And so that's kind of how you set the ground for this. And so there's all these it's amazing because the way the Bodhisattva is so concise, right? This is just in a few lines, this poetry, but it really captures this whole series of practices and of philosophies, so to speak, that have come out of it.
You know what struck me just right now in reading this is, in Islam, there's a concept called niyat. And niyat, roughly translated, means intention. And all major prayers that, the 5 times a day prayers that Muslims do begin with a niyat, which is to say they begin with an intention. And this is quite interesting. Even I feel like this is the case in many spiritual traditions. There's something that happens when, before beginning a prayer, one specifically verbalizes an intention. It's almost like it sets the ground, it creates a space, it holds the energy. There's so many things that creating an intention does. It's a construct. It's like scaffolding, right, for the prayer, and it holds its structural integrity, and it creates it's like fuel in the engine as well, if you will. And so then the prayer goes forward. I find that such an interesting similarity in traditions.
I agree. I was actually just reflecting on this before we started recording when I was doing kind of my final prep. And this notion of reverence, I think, is, if I were to use an English word, intention is one, but intention can be used. You can set an intention to, clean your shoes. Intention isn't tied to anything in particular, but like reverence, I think, is a really important, for me, it's an important word. And it kind of sets that tone of like respect, contemplation, appreciation, all these things that are basically reverence without saying it. The things that go into reverence. I think that that's one of the things that comes out of, well, one, you start with it, that, beginning, and then through this chapter in particular, it's building and building and building that sense of reverence, which is one of the things that you come out of this practice with.
Yeah. Okay. I want to read a little bit more because this is really sweet.
Please.
This body I have now resigned to serve the pleasure of all living beings. Let them ever kill, despise, and beat it, using it according to their wish. And though they treat it like a toy or make of it the butt of every mockery, my body has been given up to them. Why should I make so much of it? And so let beings do to me whatever does not bring them injury. Whenever they may think of me, let this not fail to bring them benefit. And if in my regard they have a thought of anger or respect, may these states always be the cause whereby their good and wishes are fulfilled. All those who slight me to my face or do to me some other evil, even if they blame or slander me, may they attain the fortune of enlightenment. I like that. It's so straightforward. It's so simple. And even just reading it right now, no one goes through life being admired and loved by everyone. There's always going to be someone that gets pissed off by you at what you do. No one's ever going to be completely happy with you, nor should it be the case. But these phrases, these verses for me really help me, because it's like, even in that, you are giving of yourself and you wish for those states. They're thinking of you. Even their anger towards you, may it ultimately be the cause of their awakening, of their enlightenment. It's superb because it takes what would otherwise be a painful experience. No one likes to be judged or blamed. It encapsulates it in a context that is so much more than the petty squabbles at that level. In so doing, completely transforms the experience. It does for me when I read it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, as I said before, that's the power of this prayer. That's the power of practicing like this. This isn't philosophy, right? This is, an aspiration, a practical aspiration, to have this attitude when someone criticizes you, to, instead of think either badly about yourself or about them, to instead immediately pray and hope that that anger is a seed for their own enlightenment. And this is something that Buddhist teachers, especially Buddhist teachers who grow up in monastic communities or around other, large Buddhist communities. So this is something that they train in very rigorously. It's not all like profound non-dual wisdom. It's a lot of practicing this right here and generating this sense of compassion and desire to benefit all beings. And it's something that, I think a lot of us have relatively fleeting moments, remembering to wish for the enlightenment of all beings, or to remember that when someone does slight us, they'll think positively about them and their future enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it. But this is something that Buddhists seriously train in. It's genuine, it becomes very genuine, not just words on a page, not just a prayer. It becomes the way one's mind reacts to these things. And so Adam, you're a big fan of Lojong.
Yeah.
Mahayana Buddhist mind training, which is...
It's practical. That's why I like it so much, yeah.
Yeah, it's practical, and it's this is all encompassed in that.
It's funny, yeah, we call it Lojong. that idea of mind training is in all traditions. It's certainly in the Christian tradition and certainly in the Muslim tradition, but it's this idea that life. I had someone once tell me spirituality is not what you do, it's how you respond to what happens in life. And I liked that as a particular definition of spirituality because it's something you can train in. You can train your response, right? Something happens that is a struggle, a challenge, anything from not having finances, not being supported, trouble in a relationship. But it's not exactly what you say or what you do necessarily that matters, but it's how you respond internally. Do you suffer? Do you blame yourself? Do you blame the other person? Do you react? Do you judge? Or do you transform the experience and do you create a larger context for it? Do you reframe it? That's like even devoid of religiosity and philosophy, you have the concept of reframing in psychology, which is the same idea. Like you transform the experience.
Yeah, absolutely. These are achievable results. This isn't something that only lives in the world of Shantideva. These are real practices that one can take on. This book is, if you like that kind of thing and you're interested, buy this book and read it over and over again and contemplate each verse and what it means. And I really recommend the Nectar of Manjushri's speech as well. There's a lot of context in there for these things, and make it a practice. See what happens. Do it for a week, do it for 30 days, see what happens at the end of it. If you've seen any benefit, and kind of make a decision for yourself if this is something that is, worth continuing to pursue.
I'd like to share a little personal experience. I was reading this in preparation for our call when I had something challenging happen to me, and I just want to share with everybody how practical this really is. So I finished a really challenging week at work in the hospital, a lot of death, a lot of unexpected death in the ICU, and extremely, extremely busy with this new wave and whatnot. And apparently a couple of the nurses found me to be very terse with them, like very direct and not my usual cheerful self, which I am. And they took offense to it because there was a couple of things that I saw that weren't happening correctly, and I provided some feedback for it to make sure it didn't happen again and that sort of thing. But they took it the wrong way and took it personally, and I found out that they were quite upset with me. Maybe not super upset, but they were upset. Now, when I found that out, a couple of things happened in me. First, I felt bad. I didn't mean for what I said to hurt them in any way. That's never, anyone who knows me knows that I'm genuinely a mild-mannered person. But then I also felt guilty. I'm like, gosh, I didn't mean to hurt them. Maybe I could have done things differently. And so here's the thing that started to happen. I started to feel guilt, feel shame, and then get upset that things were taken personally. Now, I could stay and wallow in that, right? And suffer. Or I can reframe, I can recontextualize, I can transform the experience. And fortunately, I was reading this chapter, so I immediately went to a place of compassion. First, I went to a place of compassion for myself, and I told myself, it was not my intention, and understanding that I was going through a very difficult time balancing the struggle. So generating a field of love for myself, right? And stopping that spiral of guilt and shame. That did it for me. Then I started to really love myself. And then being able to love myself, I could then go and think about the nurses and realize, they're equally super stressed. They're all doing their best to care for the patient. So even if we make mistakes, so what, and having compassion for them and for what they're doing. And then even beyond that, as Shantideva guided, which was that may this experience itself for me and may this experience for them be the cause for an awakening, be the cause for enlightenment, be the cause for an evolution of being. And just regardless of what they feel beyond this point about the situation, knowing that that's a wish in my heart for them, I feel makes a difference and it matters. Just doing that practice has been very transformative. I feel very, very much a different person in relation to what happened. I just felt like I wanted to share that because we talk about this in a lofty way sometimes, but it's very applicable. It's very applicable.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. I have my own kind of experience, which I've already told you about, but I haven't framed it for you in terms of this chapter. So on Wednesday night, my wife and I were getting ready for bed, and we live in a small house, a 900 square foot house. I had just taken my contacts out, and so I'm without glasses or contacts, I'm very blind. Things start getting blurry, like 8 inches from my face max. And so I walked out of the bathroom, and I turned the corner, and there was a very large shirtless man standing in our living room. My initial reaction was one of, I tend to want to talk things out. So I initially was like, should I talk things out? But I couldn't see, right? I have no vision. I can't see. Does he have anything in his hands? Is he looking at me weird? Does he, what's his intention?
Oh, man.
So I made the decision to just kind of explode at him to get him out of my house verbally. I screamed at him with a lot of curse words to get him out of my house. And I could very quickly tell that he was very drunk or high or something and wasn't aggressive. It probably stumbled into the wrong house. And so that part itself was the screaming. Certainly that was a kind of a defense mechanism, because it's not just me, it's my wife is here as well, and I have to make a decision about the safety of the family. But after that, as soon as I decided, this is where this training comes in handy, is because after that, as soon as I realized what was going on, the emotion stopped. There was no continuation into like blind rage or violence or fury or defensiveness or anything like that. The emotion stopped, and I was able to just I still called 911. I don't know what's happening. I need to make sure that he's not a danger to anyone else or me or anything like that, or my wife. But, it's the ability for the mind to switch. Like you were saying, right? It's the flexibility of the mind and the emotions to switch on a moment's notice with new information and to not get trapped in these patterns of anger. As Shantideva says further on in the book, there's a chapter on patience. And for me, this is one of the most powerful parts of the book for me. He says, even a single flash of anger can undo lifetimes and lifetimes of work on oneself. And to really be careful with our anger and with our negative emotions, so it's just the ability to shift into a more balanced state of mind, maybe even a compassionate state of mind, from going from get out of my house to I really hope this person's okay.
Yeah.
That was my wish when the police arrived. I wanted to make sure that he was okay and that everyone was okay. It was no longer about, vengeance or something like that, perceived harm. Not that screaming at a man isn't necessarily, a super compassionate action.
Well, but that's exactly the point. It doesn't have to do with what you do per se,
right?
But
right.
What was going on inside you.
Yeah, exactly. It's that internal state, and this is the training: is that you can shift out of these things. You can shift your emotional state with intention. And so when they study these, there's a famous Yongey Mingyur, a Tibetan Lama. He's done a lot of studies with neurologists on the brain, and they found that he can turn off and on compassion like a switch, really strong. And he just from training, his brain is flexible enough that he can turn it on and off whenever they tell him to. And it's genuine. It's not just he's faking it somehow. It's in the brain. They can measure it.
They can see it happen.
There's a flexibility that comes when you do this long enough that you can snap out of negative emotions very much more quickly and have context for them and change that and reframe them, as you said.
Thank you. That's great. I remember you sharing that story with me, but now I have a Shantideva context of it.
Yeah, we brought it back to Buddhism. It's okay.
In our last few minutes, I wanted to read the last 3 verses of the chapter, which I think speaks to the poetic nature, the poetic skill of Shantideva, but also the exuberance and, like I said, the underlying joy of the practice of compassion.
Yeah.
This is verse 32, 33, 34. It is the mighty sun that utterly dispels the misty ignorance of wandering beings. The creamy butter, rich and full, that's churned from milk of holy teaching. Living beings, wayfarers upon life's paths, who wish to taste the riches of contentment. Here before you is the supreme bliss. Here, O ceaseless travelers, is your fulfillment. And so today, within the sight of all protectors, I summon beings, calling them to Buddhahood. And till that state is reached, to every earthly joy. May gods and demigods and all the rest rejoice. Churn the creamy butter rich and full. I love this. I mean, he starts off with joy, he ends with joy. It's very clear to me, like, to truly have compassion. And here's the thing, one can have compassion in a joyful state with wisdom. And that's why they go so well together, because if you can see that everything is essentially causes and conditions, nothing holds any weight anymore. Like, life becomes this incredible levity of being. It's playful because you realize there's no inherent substance to anything. Yes, you pay your bills, you live your life normally, but when you can see it's all causes and conditions, it's just then things become light.
I completely agree. I think that's one of the common experiences of realizing sort of wisdom, is that everything becomes very light, almost a play. And in Buddhism, we, like how you phrase that, the causes and conditions is how a Buddhist might say that. Yeah. Buddhism makes what I heard in the piece that you shared is there are many ways to temporarily relieve suffering. There's many ways to temporarily relieve suffering. And I think Buddhism in particular, and it does this consciously, I think other religions do it as well, for sure, but Buddhism does it very consciously and logically, really make an argument for why developing something like bodhicitta is a permanent solution for unhappiness. It's no longer seeking temporary refuges. It's in developing and indeed seeking to further develop bodhicitta as a practice and as an intention in reverence is a path to permanent cessation of suffering. It's a very powerful statement. And when one taps into that, one can see why.
Well, in the last minute or two, what would you say is a takeaway for readers or listeners on this only single chapter 3 of The Way to the Bodhisattva?
Chapter 3, yeah. I would say don't shortchange yourself into thinking that you can't do this. Don't fall into the belief that this isn't for you, or that it's somehow, even if you're not sold on Buddhism, it's fine. But just this, like we said, you can find it in the prayer of St. Francis. There are analogs all over the place. And I recommend that you find the one that works for you and know that this is, it might seem fake at first, like if you try to practice this and make it kind of a ritual for yourself, but that very quickly stops being that. The benefits of doing so are really profound and long-lasting. It's worth doing. So if it sounds weird and kind of fake, please try it. If it, you'll know if it is or not by doing it.
Yeah. That's well said. Compassion is universal. My invitation to anyone listening is whatever you're struggling with right now, whatever that problem is that's front and foremost for you at this exact moment, and you know what it is. If you're listening to this, the thing that just popped into your mind, that thing, see how you can bring compassion to that and see what happens.
Love it.
All right, sir. As usual, a total joy.
Yeah. It was a wonderful episode.
Maybe we can do another chapter on this at some point.
Yeah, let's come back to it. There's several more chapters, so we got lots of more material.
All right, buddy. You have a great day.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Bye.